So we are on Mere Christianity. We're looking at book 3, which deals with what he calls Christian behavior. Remember, this began as a series of broadcast talks, which then morphed into, because it was popular, the initial broadcast talks were popular, to a couple of books, one on right and wrong, a clue to the meaning of the universe. By the way, the word clue in English means a ball of yarn. That's a clue of yarn, is the wrapped up ball of yarn. So a clue, you pull it out and something connects to it. It's like a thread. So the clue actually is the connecting issue that pulls things together. So the clue here to the meaning of the universe is follow this thread of argument. The second is what Christians believe, and I think that's where this will come in, namely chapter 3, Christian behavior. So let's begin with this, and he wants to, and this is a very long chapter. It has, of all of the parts of the Mere Christianity, this is the most comprehensive, and it's the most difficult for me to get through. If I wanted to cover each of the 11 parts, it would push me to be running through it at extraordinary speed, and I'm not going to do that. So I'm just going to be jumping around a little bit, and I would like to do otherwise, but I don't really have much of a choice if I'm going to say anything worth saying and not just get through it. So the 3 parts of morality that he talks about, and note that Lewis always begins with these terrific little anecdotes that pull you into the stories. And again, these are exemplary for essays. And it struck me as I read this, years on, having taught literature and reading a lot of essays, that Lewis is writing a series of 2,000 word essays. They're all 2,000 word essays. And then he just connects them, but he sticks to a particular topic, and he does it by introducing it with a little ball of yarn right at the beginning. And then he pulls out from this. So the story here is, again, seemingly just to break the ice, but it pulls you into this. And by this point in Mere Christianity, we are either with him or not. And if we're with him, we're reading. And if we're not, we've stopped reading it probably. And so everything began on his opening gambit, the little anecdote that he gave about fairness at the beginning, as a sense of the moral nature of the universe and how conscience is actually a clue to the fact that we are moral beings. And the indubitability of conscience, the fact that everyone has one, and they regard it as normative, and regard it as normative in others as well, for which reason they feel injustice when people are being unfair. So he began with that, but now he's going to dig down on that when he comes to Christian behavior in the 3 parts of morality, and he introduces it with this little story. There is a story about a schoolboy who was asked what he thought God was like. He replied that as far as he could make out, God was, quote, the sort of person who's always snooping around to see if anyone is enjoying himself and then trying to stop it. And I'm afraid that is the sort of idea that the word morality raises in a good many people's minds, something that interferes, something that stops you having a good time. And that view of morality as a restraint on enjoyment is, I think, the dominant view of our culture. That's what morality is. It's busybodiness. It's people imposing a view on individuals for which there is no good basis other than subjective opinion. If you go back to what we said in discussing the abolition of man about the Tao, they believe that anything referring to our moral nature is simply subjective preference, and it's merely our own feelings about that particular matter, and then trying to big it up and talk about it as a social thing. But really it's restraining and repressing our individuality, and in that sense, it is a restraint on our very humanity. So that's the case against morality, is that it restrains our humanity. Not only restrains it, represses it, in some senses violates it. And so Lewis's case needs to be you're misunderstanding the nature of morality and also misunderstanding human nature and what those particular things that we call moral observations are actually doing here. And so he reframes it here. So rather than that stopping you have a good time, in reality, moral rules are directions for running the human machine. Now, it's a very, in a sense, detached way of putting it, and considering the human machine is probably not the most elegant way of putting it, but he is trying to talk about function. And so the best way to speak of functionality might be through an appeal to the human organism and the parts of the body and so forth, which is how the New Testament speaks of relations within the body of Christ, for instance. There's the appeal to the body, the head, the hands, the feet, etc. in that sense. But for his contemporary audience, the appeal to a machine is helpful because they can see that machines don't function if they don't have all the parts, and they're not put together properly, and they're not lubricated well, and they don't have the fuel, etc., etc. So rethink of this. Moral rules are directions for running the human machine, and then he's going to talk about the human machine in relation to other humans, etc., but I'll get to that in a sec. But he goes on to say, every moral rule is there to prevent a breakdown or a strain or a friction in the running of that machine. And that is why these rules at first seem to be constantly interfering with our natural inclinations. At first. When you're being taught how to use any machine, the instructor keeps on saying, no, don't do it like that. You have to be told how to use. You have to read the directions. You can't, as most of us want to do when they have one of these do-it-yourself, put-it-together things, just start doing it. Because you'll find that the part that looks like it fits here actually is not meant to be put in at this stage, or if you have one of those horrid IKEA things, something that looks like it's the right part, 5 hours later you realize that actually that was needed later, and the part you needed earlier was this piece, and because you didn't put that in, you have to take the whole thing apart and start all over again. Maybe that's a little bit too much self-description there for this class, but how many times have I been there and done that and just read the directions, if only the directions were easy to understand, which they're not. But I'm referring to IKEA here, not referring to the moral law, which is quite easy to understand. And the objection to it is the very one that he's already raised. It's not that we don't understand what's being said, it's we don't like it. We don't want to follow the law, the moral law that's been laid down before us. We don't want to do it. And because of that, we try to find reasons why it shouldn't apply to us. But it should apply to other people, because we can see that the moral law there is in some sense a restriction, a restraint, or an oppression of our human nature, and so we think it should apply to them. Now, he's noticed both aspects here. One, we don't like it applying to ourselves. Two, we do like it applied to other people. And he's already touched on that aspect of our human nature, which he calls sin. That perverse aspect of us which defies rational explanation other than to simply call it sin. We contradict ourselves. We don't even understand our own selves. We see a log in somebody else's eye. We think the same log is a speck in our eye, and we distort all things. We see them out of proportion. But the rules are there so that we enjoy ourselves. So all the things that are said that God was against is actually what God is for. It's there to help us have a good time. That's a very trite way of putting it, but it's so that we delight. The moral law is delightful. It is to further human nature, not to restrict it. Anyway, that's why these rules at first seem to be constantly interfering with our natural inclinations. Now that begs the question of natural inclinations. What do we mean by that? He's going to say natural is our fallen natural inclinations. We gravitate. Yes, our concupiscence, if you will. Our natural inclinations begs qualification. Our assumption that natural inclinations are good is because we are like the romantics and think that everything that is natural is good, because the romantics posit nature as a solely good quasi-divine entity of which we're a part. We're part of nature. Nature is good, therefore we are good. And so anything that's natural to us must be good and must be worth affirming. But that is a fallacious assumption that nature is good. And the mere look at the natural world will tell you that there's a great deal in nature that is not good. In fact, all sorts of things that we call evil within it as well. So it begs scrutiny, and it doesn't bear up to it. At any rate, when you're being taught how to use any machine, the instructor keeps on saying, no, don't do it like that, because of course there are all sorts of things that look all right and seem to you the natural way of treating the machine, but do not really work. Some people prefer to talk about moral ideals rather than moral rules, and about moral idealism rather than moral obedience. Because at that point, it's all dependent on us. An ideal is something that we project. And that's another fallacious understanding here of morality, is that is something that we aspire to. And you will hear that regularly, even unfortunately in Christian institutions, that we have certain ideals that we don't measure up to, but we don't have ideals. We have rules. And they're not something that we create, they're something that God gives to us. And therefore, when we fall short of them, there needs to be consequences for the good of those who fall short of the ideals or flat out contradict them or violate them. Lifestyle policies and so forth. If they were only ideals that we were aspiring to, then we could change the ideals, for one. And two, we would never sanction anyone for falling short of the ideals, because ideals are never going to be met. And there would be no good in sanctioning them, because again, the people that were idealizing were also not perfect, and so there would never be any benefit from following the rules. There would be no blessing to the person concerned, just restrictions for those that don't meet the ideal. So it's a very skewed idea of what a moral law is. But in the sense that moral perfection is an ideal, in that sense, every kind of perfection is an ideal. We can't succeed in being perfect car drivers or perfect tennis players or in drawing perfectly straight lines. But there is another sense in which it is very misleading to call moral perfection an ideal. When a man says that a certain woman or house or ship or garden is, quote, his ideal, unquote, he does not mean, unless he's rather a fool, that everyone else ought to have the same ideal. That's not what we mean by it. In such matters, we are entitled to have different tastes and therefore different ideals. We can have different cars. We can have different wives. We can have different houses. We don't have to all have the same house. We don't mean that. If it was the ideal, then everyone would have to have that. You would have to have the face that launched 1,000 ships. But it is dangerous to describe a man who tries very hard to keep the moral law as a man of high ideals, because it's not a private taste at all. This goes back to what he said in The Abolition of Man. It is not a subjective preference and my ideal form of this. It's not an expression of myself. It is something outside myself, above myself, a standard to which I myself acknowledge and to which I am subject. So I'm not above the law. The law is above me. Very clear and, quite frankly, if it's rightly understood, easy to understanding of the moral law, which we don't, because we think we're above the law. And our politicians think that they're above the law. And our pastors think they're above the law. They don't see themselves as something, the law is something that they're under, including the kings, the prime ministers, the princes, whatever you want to say. There's a standard that is above them, to which they are subject. And by being subject, they're not restrained in their humanity, they are blessed in their humanity. That is the thing that will bring them blessing. So, perfect behavior may be as unattainable as perfect gear changing when we drive. He's thinking of a standard, but it is necessary, ideal, as prescribed for all men by the very nature of the human machine. So, two ways in which it goes wrong. One, when human individuals drift apart from one another or collide with one another and do damage, we call it cheating or bullying. That's one way we do it, one way we go wrong. So that's between people. There's another way in which we go wrong, which is not related to other people, but related to ourselves. So you're going to see it in both senses. There's two ways that we see it. We tend to see it in relation to other people. That's clearer. That's why Plato writes the Republic. He sees it in social relations. It's easy to perceive injustice. So let me talk about injustice on a social level. But he says so that it's the microcosm, macrocosm analogy, that everything I'm saying about social relations is actually true of what resides within an individual. But that's harder to see. So let me talk about it in terms of social justice, to use the phrase, honestly. But Lewis is going to talk about it, and it's going to be the key point. And the pivot around everything that will turn is it isn't the case, as the Enlightenment has always said, and as we still assume in our sociology classes, that the fundamental clash is between the individual and society. That's the fundamental clash. And the fundamental problem is the relation of society to the individual. And so if you're a libertarian, you want to maximize individual good by getting rid of as much of society as you can. And the problem with that, of course, is people don't act well. And so people need a social framework in order to survive, some of them, and certainly to flourish, all but the richest and most powerful. So, and the big problem with the socialist view, which emerges in the Enlightenment, which is given expression by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Romantics to begin with, this individual society relation, is that it ignores human nature, actually. First of all, it cuts God out of the picture. Second of all, it doesn't consider the family. Remember, Rousseau is a man who had 5 children out of wedlock and put them all in orphanages. And he's the one who writes the social contract. So without disparaging Mr. Rousseau, his idea of social justice is rather a skewed one. And again, one in which he takes no responsibility as a father and a husband, for that matter. So the family's cut out of it, and so is church teaching on social relations. The church has no role, the family has no role. It's just me and society being the political order of things. And so then it all becomes skewed by this conversation, whether you're on the left or whether you're on the right. I'm afraid Mr. Rousseau's terms of engagement tend to dominate the airwaves. Lewis is coming back to a pre-Enlightenment view of the importance of the individual, but the individual is going to be connected in other ways besides that with society. It's going to be connected with God, first of all, through the church, but also through the family and the relations between husbands and wives and children and their parents, for example. So it can go wrong, to backtrack a little bit and repeat what I just said. It can go wrong when people collide together, when they do damage to one another through cheating or bullying, or they can go wrong within the individual. And I said this one's harder for us to see, although it was not hard for the ancients to see. We first have to set our own house in order. And actually, that's just plain Christian teaching. If you want to correct your neighbor, start with correcting yourself. If you want to be a clean vessel, you have to clean the inside of your dish before, and then the whole dish is clean. And the problem is that the heart is corrupted. That's where the sin comes from. It's not done to you from the outside. The problem originates within the human heart, which John Calvin calls an idol factory. We never stop creating false ideals. We never stop. There's no end to them. The errors in which mankind will come. I did the foolish thing of pushing that, which I should not do. So when he talks about the three parts of morality, we want to talk about three things then. One, something that happens between individuals. That's what we call society. And we will call the right form of relations between individuals either harmony or fair play. That's how he began the whole Mere Christianity, with the notion of fair play and relations with others. So he began the same place Plato did, interestingly, in the Republic. He learned from reading Plato. And remember, he says, the professor at the out says, don't they read Plato anymore? Well, Lewis has read Plato. So that's the first way. Morality is concerned with relations between individuals. Secondly, it has a function within the individual, harmonizing things within us, harmonizing and putting things in the right order internally. That's, again, what the Republic is about, is putting the reason over the passions through the means of the spirited element, which he calls the thumos, the chest. The chest are the virtues that keep the passions in the right order, which we perceive rationally. And that's what the virtues are there. The chest, full of the moral virtues, restrain the passions and put them in the right order. But that's what you have to do first. So this is actually the most important one, the second one. And that's what he's going to talk about in greatest detail. And the third is thinking of human life as a whole. Maybe we could call it teleologically. What's the purpose of human life? What is the meaning of life? To what do we derive our greatest pleasure, our greatest sense of eudaimonia, to use Aristotle's phrase, or blessedness, to use a Christian phrase? And in that sense, that's where philosophy and theology particularly come in the third sense, the whole purpose and meaning of life. And it's not without reason that the most popular intellectual of our day, Jordan Peterson, is making a great deal of hay, because he's actually speaking to the issues of meaning and purpose. He's talking about the third issue. But the third issue, the big picture, which is very important, is the consequence and is connected with social relations and rightly orienting yourself and understanding it. While I was preparing this, I thought about music, because he repeatedly refers to harmony. And I'm not going to, you know what, I'm just going to point to it on the YouTube, my own YouTube channel, where I talk about the three types of music that Boethius talks about it in his treatise on music. Because he talks about, briefly, the music of the spheres, cosmological music. Well, that's the meaning and purpose of all things. That's the third thing he just mentioned. He talks about the music instrumentalis, the one that other people hear, the instrument of the voice, the instrument of guitar or piano or whatever. That's the musica instrumentalis. But then there's the musica humana, and that's the music that in which we feel joy and delight from the other types of music. And that involves the harmonizing within our souls, within our spirits. We sense order and purpose and harmony, and we attribute beauty to particular notes and scales. We can hear it in instrumental music. We can't hear it in the music of the spheres, but it exists there. So Boethius talks about all three, and it struck me that Lewis here, although he doesn't mention music, and he skips it when it comes to the discarded image, he says he doesn't know enough about the quadrivium. Well, I don't either, but he should have cited Boethius there, because that's the importance of music, is that it reflects the harmony within the soul and within society, for which reason Plato in his Laws says that if you want to destroy a society, you change its music. That's why he says it. It sounds like a weird thing to say, and it is weird in the sense, but what it's suggesting is that you're deviating from a mathematical and physical understanding of the universe, which is true, and as a consequence, he thinks it has an effect on human nature itself and social relations. So music is a very important subject for the soul, and people now play music to calm themselves and so forth, and set themselves a sense of order. And I think people that listen to disorderly, disruptive music show the evidence of that. And our society is a good illustration of it. But at any rate, he goes on to say, and this is really important, in relation to the law, because then we're talking about Christian morality, you can't make people good by the law. And furthermore, you can't have a good society without good men. And that's why we have to consider first, how do we make a good man? And what is a good man? So the fundamental issue of Christian morality is not the first thing that we think of, which is the social relationships that we think and attribute to social justice. The first thing is, what does it mean to have a moral soul, an orderly soul, a just soul? What does that mean? And how do we get there? And this is particularly important because of one thing that comes out of Christian doctrine, which is the idea that the individual human soul is going to last eternally. Very important. If it were not already clear from reading the Plato and the Greeks, the importance of the individual, Christianity doubles down on it and says it's even more important than that, because your soul will last eternally. And so if you are not just to your own soul and don't understand and live justly, that is going to have eternal consequences for you. And what begins as an apparently slight miscalculation is going to lead downstream to a very large deviation. And one of the words for sin in the New Testament talks precisely about missing the mark. Hamartia. You miss the mark. Yeah, if you miss the mark, if it's 2 feet away from you, the bow and arrow, you just miss it. It can be this close. You just missed it. If you put that 200 feet away, you're going to find you missed the target altogether. If you put it an infinite distance of eternity away from you, that's how far you've missed the mark. So it has to be dead bang on. And sin distorts your life so that even when you do moral things in your own eyes, you probably have still missed the mark, for which reason the grace of God is necessary. You can't please God by being a moral person. You have to receive the agape love of God and be transformed by faith in Christ. Hence the necessity of faith. Without faith, no one can please the Lord, it says. Clear statement. So, but because of this, and he's talking about Christian behavior, how you conduct yourself has eternal significance. And immorality makes this other difference, which just by the by, has a connection with the difference between totalitarianism and democracy. Remember, when he first gives these broadcast talks, he's thinking of Hitler's Germany and fascist Italy and the Japanese imperial culture at the time, as opposed to the countries that profess to be democracies at any rate and have some semblance of law and order, being under the law and not ruled by a dictator in that sense. And it's this: if individuals live only for 70 years, 70 years and 10, or whatever, make it 100, I don't care, make it 50, doesn't matter, but a finite period of time, then a state or a nation or a civilization may last for 1,000 years, then it's more important than an individual. If, right? Because to say, well, society is going to far outlive you, so it is of infinite value and importance because Canada, China, the US, doesn't matter. Your nation is going to far outlive you, so what happens nationally is more important than what happens to you individually. But if, as it says in Scripture, the soul will last eternally, but nations will rise and fall, what is more important is the individual soul in it. Now, Lewis repeatedly represents this position in his own fiction, repeatedly. And it's a debate that he has with the conditioners, because the conditioners believe that's what's most important is the social. And with that, then the national. And so that's the very reason why the conditioners flourish under totalitarian governments. And if the conditioners are gaining strength in our own countries, It's because we're becoming more totalitarian. So the individual worth is comparatively small. But he says if Christianity is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important, because he's everlasting and his country and civilization is not. So very important. So when you hear people talk about Western civilization, again, very much part of the conservative movement. We talk about the West, Western civilization. The Western civilization has no value and no worth aside from the worth of the individuals that reside within it, that are attributed to by Western civilization. The only reason the West has any downstream currency is because of the worth it's placed on the individual soul, things like the conscience and so forth. That's why. And there is no other reason. So as soon as the emphasis is placed on society and not on the individual, you've already lost Western civilization. That's what made the West the West. That very thing. Okay, so that's the first part. And I spent the most time, because his beginnings are always his most important point. Everything is a consequence of that. So any comments or questions about that before I proceed? And I want to talk about the 4 cardinal virtues, and then he'll conclude the third book with the 3 theological virtues, although he doesn't, I think, explicitly call them that. And in between, he throws a bunch of other stuff in there miscellaneously. No? Okay. The 4 cardinal virtues. Cardinal refers to cardus, which is a hinge. And the cardinal virtues are the hinge on which everything turns. The hinge of a door on which the door swings. In the Reformation, they said that the doctrine of justification is the article, or cardus, because articulus, the same thing, is the hinge on which the church stands or falls. If it's not hinged, then it all falls. Doctrine of justification. Anyway, but cardinal virtues, now I'm speaking theologically there, cardinal virtues, every civilized people recognizes the cardinal virtues. And that's why Dante puts Cato at the bottom of Purgatorio in the Divine Comedy, because he, in the 4 stars connected in his beard, is attributed with a vast degree of knowledge of these 4 cardinal virtues. So the Roman pagans and the Greek pagans and the Germanic pagans and pretty much any pagans, insofar as they had a civilization, would have recognized these 4 cardinal virtues. And they were seen as pivotal. You pivot around them. You can't have a society without cardinal virtues. Impossible. So what are these 4 cardinal virtues? Prudence. I'll just list them. Prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. Prudence, temperance, justice, fortitude. Prudence, practical common sense. Taking trouble to think about what you're doing and what's likely to come of it. So there's an element of wisdom in it then. And remember I said last time, in relation to the 3 types of morality, that there was a teleological element of it. That's part of prudence then as well. It's not just thinking in terms of finite consequences, but infinite consequences. So what is the prudential thing to consider in the light of the fact that you have an eternal soul? And there are infinite consequences then to your actions. What is the prudential thing? It's not just the consequences for here and now, it's forever. And Lewis observes that God wants us to use every bit of sense to us that he's given to us. So we have to think these through and act accordingly. So, and this is a phrase that I really like that from Lewis. He gives these sort of Paul points out Christ never meant that we were to remain children in intelligence. So he asks us, he says, the little children shall, holds up the little child as an example to us, but that doesn't mean we're supposed to remain as children. we're supposed to long for the meat and not just the milk. And some of you want to stay like babes, and that's not what we're supposed to do. On the contrary, he told us to be not only as harmless as doves, but wise as serpents. He wants a child's heart, but a grown-up's head. He wants us to be simple, single-minded, affectionate, teachable, as good children are, but he also wants every bit of intelligence we have to be alert at his job and in first-class fighting trim. The fact that you're called to give money to a charity does not remove the necessity on your part to look into whether the charity is actually doing what it says and not fraudulently taking money and distributing it to the people running the charity. You have a responsibility, a moral responsibility as adults to think that way. Anyway, so this is why education then becomes important and vital, in fact, because we are required to use every ounce of our intellect, not that it has a weight, in order to act in a moral fashion and use our minds as God has given them to us. And this is the one thing in our day that we least have, to some, I could say. Culturally, we've given up the life of the mind. Pretty much, with very few exceptions. So that's prudence. I'm just going to run over them rather quickly. Secondly is temperance. The temperance movement, particularly in Christian circles, but even outside socially, was almost exclusively fixated on drinking. And so temperance meant refraining from drinking. The abolition movement in relation to drinking. But temperance initially meant just being tempered by it. It meant not abstaining altogether, but allowing for a certain amount, not going further than that. So drinking but not getting drunk. That's temperance. You're being temperate, just like the climate. You're not too hot, you're not too cold. There's a benefit to it, but the benefit is easily abused. So for some people, being temperate probably means abstaining from alcohol because they're particularly predisposed to abusing it. So maybe that's best for them. That doesn't mean it's a rule for everyone else, etc. So he says it's a mistake to think that Christians ought to be all teetotalers. That's Islam. He calls it Mohammedanism. But that's the teetotal religion, not Christianity. And he notes with respect to temperance, one of the marks of a certain type of bad man is that he cannot give up a thing himself without wanting everyone else to give it up. That's not the Christian way. We have liberty on these things, although we're not to abuse the liberty. Paul talks about the weaker brother and so forth, being aware of his conscience and so forth. So you might want to consider that. So note the complexity of Christian teaching on moral actions and so forth. But he says that somebody who is obsessed with golf or football or his car, or conversely, he says a woman who's devoted to clothes or her dog or her appearance is just as intemperate as somebody who gets drunk every evening. So there's a temperance in relation to all sorts of things. So there's a moderation, there's a right ordering. Thirdly, justice. Well, he spent a great deal of time talking about justice, so he doesn't go into it much here. But it is what we deal with in the law courts. But it's the old name for everything that resides under fairness. Honesty is part of justice, telling the truth, not bearing false witness. Giving and taking. I've given you that. I've given you that. I would expect something in return. That would be fair. When you give charity, it's a different thing. You're not expecting to be paid back. But in terms of justice, you would expect it back. Keeping promises, all these things fit under justice. Finally, fortitude. Fortitude is related to courage. We'll often call it that. And courage we associate primarily with the face of danger. but it's also an internal thing. Guts is the way he says we usually describe it in English. You stick with something and you don't give it up. So you can display fortitude or courage in your marriage. You can display fortitude in your business. You're going to stick with what's right. You're going to do the things, you're going to operate in the right way, even though you're not being rewarded for it. So that's a certain type of fortitude or courage. There's a virtue in that. And the reason you do it, despite the fact that you're not being rewarded for it in terms of immediate consequences, is because, again, you have the teleological view, and you know that ultimately the actions that you're doing socially are a function of the way you are ordering your soul. You're doing the right thing for the right reason. You're doing it because it's right. And it has a consequence for you. That's Plato argues that repeatedly. The man who does injustice harms his own soul, so he would not want to be a tyrant. He says that a tyrant is the least happy of all men, although he can do whatever he wants, because the tyrant has no one to restrain him from doing an unjust thing. So he doesn't want that sort of power. He would become a very bad man, and it would destroy his soul. You don't want power if you can't restrain yourself. Be careful what you wish for. So that sense of fortitude. And you will notice that you can't practice any of the other virtues very long without having fortitude. You can't be just for very long, because when you act justly, you're going to get attacked for it. Right? The prophets are just. They are killed by their own people. People who are lacking fortitude cannot be temperate for very long. They can't stick with their convictions. They're going to give way. And finally, they can't be prudent without courage either. So you could say that courage is, in the sense, the leading virtue. Most people don't see it that way. They would think that prudence is the right, knowing what the right thing to do in the right circumstance with the eternal in view is probably the chief of the four cardinal virtues. But I think there's a debate among that. So concluding this, acting out our virtues is a quality of your character. Very important. It's not the result of particular actions. To be virtuous is to have a quality of character. You are prudent, you are temperate, you are just, you have fortitude, you're courageous. These are qualities of your character. And because of that, you act in accordance with your character, and the right actions that are done for the wrong reason don't help build up the internal quality of your character. So you have to do the right thing for the right reason. And the right reason is, again, internally defined, first of all. But when I say it's internally defined in conformity with the divine revelation of what constitutes lawful character or good character. And that will not only relate to the temporal virtues, or that is the cardinal virtues, it will relate chiefly to the theological virtues. So you cannot be a just individual. You can't be a temperate one, one with fortitude or prudent, without being a Christian, actually. Ultimately. All of these other virtues are of this world, and then there are virtues that are of another world, but the other world will last eternally, and it will inform these virtues of temperance and justice and fortitude and prudence. And the reason why I say that is because, and Lewis makes this very clear, God doesn't want people who simply obey a set of rules. He wants a particular type of people. Not just obey the rules. The rules are there not for him, but for us. It's to fashion a people that will be his bride. He's the bridegroom. It's to make us suitable for an eternal relationship with God, with whom we will reside after this mortal earthly life. That's why it's there. So in part 3, he goes on to social morality. I think I'm going to skip over this although a great deal of time could be spent on this, because then it gets into politics as well, and he gets into the left and the right side of Christian society, and I think it's interesting. I'll just say that with the true Christian society, he makes a couple comments here that are probably worth noting, and this does relate to politics, but as I say, I don't want to get into it too much, because it's probably a lecture on its own. And that is, if there were such a society as a true Christian society in existence, and he says, and you and I visited it, I think we should come away with a very curious impression. We should feel that its economic life was very socialistic, and in that sense advanced, but that its family life and its code of manners were rather old-fashioned, ceremonious, aristocratic. That's his general impression. So a Christian society would distribute wealth. It would give charitably. It would do so in what we would normally associate with socialism. Except in socialism, the state redistributes wealth. But whereas a Christian society would be marked by charitable giving on a large scale. And its private life would be ordered by a very old-fashioned, ceremonious, aristocratic type of familial relationship. That's what a Christian society would look like, with big picture. And he says everyone wants a bit of that, but doesn't want the whole bit. And so a Christian society is a very difficult thing. And he says very few would like the whole thing, and he says that's just what one would expect if Christianity is the total plan for the human machine. And each one of us has departed from that in his own particular ways. And everyone is attracted to one bit and repulsed by another bit. So the requirement of charity is one that most people find repugnant, because you're giving to people that don't deserve it. There's no justice in it. That's correct. There's no justice in it. You can talk about social justice. Actually, it's not social justice. It's charity. If it were justice, then it wouldn't be charity anymore. Charity is giving things to people who don't deserve it. Stop calling it social justice. That's Marxism. Social justice is not charity. You can't. Charity does not exist in Marxism. It originates in the state, and it is forcible. It's not given out of love. It's not given out of freedom. Both of those are denied. His final comment, and this is this last bit of section 4 that I think is really important. It reiterates what I said about the teleological aspect of these moral virtues. Let's see if I can find it here. I'll just read. I've got it in my notes here. Every time you make a choice, you're turning a part of you, and remember he talked about the significance of individual choices, from the freedom. Every moral choice you make is changing you into something better than you were before, or worse. There is a consequence to moral actions, for good and for ill. And every time you make a little choice, the composite of all those individual choices will transform you as a person. If you do it for the sake of God and for the sake of the love of God and the love of your neighbor, if you make the choices for that reason with fortitude and all of the temporal virtues in mind, what he calls the cardinal virtues, it will make you a different person. You will become fit for heaven. And you're slowly turning into a thing that is either a heavenly creature or a hellish creature. And that's how he described it in The Great Divorce, right? In a sense, he's talking about earthly life, but he's talking about the heaven and the hell within the context of an earthly life, and people moving towards that or moving away from it. So in a sense, they're already in hell or they're already in heaven on the basis of the individual choices they make. So it's a teleological way of looking at this. And Furthermore, there's a consequence to this, and Lewis can make this comment because he is a good man. And Paul was the exact same thing. Remember, Paul says that he's the worst of all sinners, which we find extraordinary for him to say this, because clearly he isn't the worst. Is he not lying when he says that? No, he's not lying. He's marking his awareness of something that he would not have been aware had he not been so good. And that is, the better you become, the more clearly you understand that evil is still left in you. The more discerning you are, the better you are, the more aware you are of your own evil inclinations. When a man is becoming worse through his choices, he loses a discernment of his own wickedness. There's the converse to it. The better you become, the more aware of how bad you are. The worse you become, the less aware of your wickedness. Your conscience becomes seared. You lose moral awareness, and you're more angry, more and more angry about it. And again, Lewis repeatedly. But he's just talking about now about what Scripture speaks about in terms of people's awareness. They get worse and worse and worse. And so in the end, they not only do unrighteous things, they approve of it, and they require the law to conform to that. Society has to approve what I personally like and dislike. So, in conclusion, good people know about both good and evil. Bad people do not know about either. Oh, well, there's an interesting one. Good people know about good and evil. Bad people know. It's not only that they don't know about good, they don't know about evil either. They're morally insensible. It's like they're drunk. They have no awareness. Yes? Yes, so Augustine, when he's talking about evil, he adopts the position that becomes the Orthodox Christian position, which is that evil does not exist per se, but rather is the privation of the good. To say that evil exists is to give it an entity, and then you lapse into Manichaean heresy. There are two principles in the world, one of good and one of evil, and they're battling it out. We perceive good and evil, but if we gave evil that sort of position, then God could not be God, because you would have two gods, and they'd be battling it out. So that's not a possible position. Evil does not exist in the sense of having an entity that is an eternally existent one, like we would refer to of God. So what is evil then? Then the perception of, well, it's a privation or a lack of goodness in the good thing, a lack of being, if you will. So it is a consequence of that, is that the more you give yourself over to doing a bad thing, the less goodness you have within yourself and a less awareness that it collapses with it. And so you become, to some degree, like the shades in the underworld, a shadowy essence of yourself. And that's exactly how Lewis portrays it in The Great Divorce again. Whereas when you come to heaven, the heavenly reality, it is actually real and solid, substantial. That's a place that you and I can't put our foot in on the grass, because it's going to cut our feet. We're not good enough. There's something that of evil that we've been carrying with us that we haven't even acknowledged. But the more that we feed and get closer to the good, the more the privation of the good in us disappears. Just the way the light casts away a mist, or the light dispels the darkness. Right? It says in John's Gospel, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not comprehended it. I think he's talking about relation of good and evil. By the way, in the first chapter in Genesis, the first thing created is light, and that's before the sun and the moon were created. God says, "Let there be light," and separates the light from the darkness. But there's no sun or moon. He's not referring to he's referring to something, I think, metaphysical there. But God creates it, which means that, in a sense, God is above evil and darkness. but there's a possibility there. It's very little said. It just passed over. But note that it, in terms of light, and some people say this is why it's a poetic account and not an accurate literal account. It's because light exists before the sun and the moon. And for us, we see by the light of the sun or the light of the moon. But light is more than the sun and the moon's light. That's the point. These are symbols of that light. And that's why we don't worship the sun or the moon, whereas the pagans do. Always, regularly, they worship the sun and the moon and the cycles of the sun and the moon because they misunderstanding what true light is. And they believe in the light and the significance of the light, and they fear the darkness, but they don't fear the right form of darkness, or light for that matter. Anyway, so yes, I think it has to do with Augustine's declaration, and I think Lewis, by and large, is an Augustinian. If you want further support of that, look at his, this is not a work I've covered on this course, but in his preface to Paradise Lost, he talks about Milton's portrait of good and evil in Paradise Lost and says it's Augustinian. So when he talks about hell as a place where there is no light, but rather darkness visible, he's describing it in theological terms. The reason there's no light in hell is because light is associated with the presence of God, and hell is the privation of all light and all goodness. And yet the creatures there still exist, but they're deprived of all goodness. So he casts it in this form for theological reasons. And in that sense, I think is more persuasive in his presentation of hell than Dante is, who's doing something different with it. What Dante does is very interesting, but they're doing different things. I'd say that Milton's is more orthodox in that sense. In that sense, for sure. Anyway, sexual morality. I can't skip over this because everyone wants to know about this. I shouldn't speak for the people in the room. Oh, the morality and psychoanalysis. Do I want to get morality and psychoanalysis? It is sort of important insofar as people tend to see things psychoanalytically these days, or psychologically. When we're talking about moral good, moral evil, morality in general, we tend to want to associate morality with something like a herd instinct. And so he spends a great deal of time debunking that here. So I'm not going to go into that here. And actually, I think I just talked about when I talked about the importance of individual choice. And that is against the psychological profession. And remember, I said to you that, what's his name? The famous psychologist who writes Beyond Good and Evil and sees C.S. Lewis as the best representation of the B.F. Skinner, of the literatures of freedom and virtue. B.F. Skinner is the polar opposite to C.S. Lewis here. He will attribute it to a herd instinct. He will think that to make society better, we have to condition things. And he will deny the legitimacy of freedom of choice and the significance of individual freedom, individual free choices for the good, informing an eternal soul. That's because B.F. Skinner denies not only Christian doctrine, but pagan teaching on the soul. He thinks it's just you're just a material entity. As a consequence, well, then if we are just physical entities, material beings, then conditioning makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. It's the only thing that makes sense then. So if you think that, again, your psyche is just your brain, then you're not going to bother with behavioral things. You're just going to deal with chemical conditioning. That's all you're going to do when you treat people with various disorders. You're going to give them a pill. You're not going to do anything else. I'm not denying, by the way, that there can be a chemical component to mental health, moral character. There is an aspect to it. So if you don't eat for a while, you get hangry. And that pushes you to be, even if you don't do a bad thing, to being a dislikable person. So there is a connection between the body and the soul, for sure. But the question is how much, and where's the balance? And the balance for Lewis lies in the individual choice and the moral virtues which govern that choice and determine whether it's good or evil that have a teleological consequence. The psychological profession in general denies it, almost whole cloth, with a very few exceptions, and Jordan Peterson is one of them, who seems to regard the scriptures as a way of living a life even while he isn't sure that God exists. Not sure. And because he's commenting as a psychologist, and he doesn't want to get into the other sorts of things, but that's off topic here. Sexual morality. So I'll skip over Freud and the psychologists, although they're very important, particularly because they tend to be seen as the most important. By the way, in the court of law, you can call a psychologist forth as the expert witness, and it trumps every other thing, every other profession, including the other medical professions. If a mental health, like if a psychiatrist stands up and says this person is mentally unfit, the court will say, okay, well then we're not going to punish in accordance with this, we're going to treat like that. And that's the end of it. Absolute authority. Huge power. And I'm not saying anything about the people that do it. I'm just saying that's how much weight we've placed on the psychologists now in terms of their teaching function, or their function of wisdom for that matter. With respect to sexual morality, or what Christians call chastity, he says chastity needs to be disambiguated from what we call modesty. Modesty is the product of a culture. In some cultures, women have to cover their heads. In some cultures, women have to cover their arms and their legs. As Lewis comments here, a girl in the Pacific Islands wearing hardly any clothes and a Victorian lady completely covered in clothes might both be equally modest. So it's a social thing. Modesty is not the same thing as chastity, although they're connected, of course, because the one immodest clothing will invite unchaste behavior, right? So there's a social responsibility that's connected with modesty, but don't say that the two things are the same. You have to disambiguate them a little bit. So when people break the rule of propriety or modesty in their own time and place, they do it in order to excite lust in themselves or in others. So some people just like going out, basically breaking the conventions. They get off on appearing immodestly. They enjoy it. When they do this, and they do it purposefully, then they're offending against chastity. Only at that point. When you wear inappropriate, socially determined clothing, when you wear it purposefully to violate that, you're doing it against only at that point against chastity. But that's not the same thing as modesty. So when you purposefully dressed immodestly in order to incite other people or to do it for your own gratification, at that point you're veering into chastity. Lewis says this is the most unpopular of all the Christian virtues. Note that he writes this in the 40s and 50s, before the sexual revolution. I just say we think the sexual revolution began in the 1960s because that's when it triumphed, by the way. There was a fight before that, but it began in the 1930s, a book called The Sexual Revolution, 1936, by a cultural Marxist. Look it up. And it's a battle before the Second World War. So between the two world wars, Christian civilization to some degrees dies on the battlefield of the First World War in the West. And what comes out afterwards is various degrees of licensing of our libidos that Freud in particular gives utterance to. Right? The sex drive, and he connects it with our procreative tendencies, but also the non-procreative sexual urges he will think have human psychological significance and think that we need to release that in order to free the person, etc. But it's the most unpopular of the Christian virtues because Christianity seems very restrictive on this, more than any other thing. And why? Because we live in a cultural milieu in which eros has been unleashed from the Christian understanding of the proper venue for it, which is marriage. And the Christian rule is marriage with total faithfulness to your partner or total abstinence. That's it. Full stop. Doesn't matter what form it takes aside from that. And he admits this is difficult, so difficult and so contrary to our instincts that obviously either Christianity is wrong or our sexual instinct, as it now is, has gone wrong. It's either or. There's no in between on this. And the Freudians, the psychologists, the sociologists will say that the reason sex is a mess, which they all admit it is because we've tried to follow the law and follow Christian teaching on this. And the reason why is we've hushed up the underground sexual desires, and it's led to repression and misuse then. And Lewis says, they tell you sex has become a mess because it was hushed up, but for the last 20 years, it has not been hushed up. He says that in the 1950s. For the last 20 years, it hasn't been hushed up. It's been chattered about all day long, yet it is still in a mess. If hushing up had been the cause of the trouble, ventilation would have set it right, but it has not. Well, same sort of thing is being said now with respect to sexual, but now it's in relation to all sorts of different types of sexualities, which are seen even by the psychologists now as no longer being disorders, but are seen as natural expressions that we ought to endorse, including pedophilia and bestiality and so forth. It's there in the psychological studies. It's right there in the academy. It's being argued for very strongly on the basis that every sexual urge is natural and therefore good, and the repression of it, the restraint of it, will create some sort of harm to our human nature, which they understand only in material, finite terms. We have no immortal soul. So modern people, he says, are always saying sex is nothing to be ashamed of. And he says, well, you can take that two ways. They may mean there's nothing to be ashamed of in the fact that the human race reproduces itself in a certain way, nor in the fact that it gives pleasure. And if that's what they mean, he says Christians say exactly the same thing. So let's agree with it. Now, this models Lewis's, what I said was exemplary way of engaging with his opponents, and it's not falling into stupid trap. The stupid trap of opposing your opponent because he is your opponent. It's just me versus you, so I'm going to disagree with you across the board. No, I'm going to grant that sex is good. It's the way we reproduce ourselves, and we ought to have no shame in that. There's no shame in marital sex. Yes, correct. But if they mean sex is nothing to be ashamed of, they mean that whatever we desire, our sexual instincts do, is nothing to be ashamed of, then of course they're wrong. And there's where we beg to differ. Lewis says, I think they're wrong. It's not just they that he thinks are wrong. The pagans will also think that pedophilia is wrong. They still might do it, but they actually, including Plato, is against pedophilia. It's against pederasty. It's actually against homosexuality for that matter, but that's another issue, and that's a big topic of discussion. We'd have to get into that because it's common in the Greco-Roman world and so forth. But moral teaching will restrain certain types of sexuality. At the same time, while its pagan practices will actually proliferate in it, like we saw when we just did Till We Have Faces. There's a pagan sexual ritual related to Baal and Asherah worship that you will find in almost every culture under the name of Venus or Aphrodite. All sorts of things happen. So why is chastity so difficult? He says because there are three lies that are told. One, One, sexual indulgence is natural and healthy for you. This is a lie that is predicated on the goodness of our own natures. Secondly, it's predicated on the idea that the moral law, the law of human nature, doesn't apply to us. So those two things. Our nature is good, the law is bad. Whereas the truth is our nature is bad and the law is good. So those two lies playing themselves out there. I'm good. I'm a good person. Restraint of my goodness is a bad thing. The opposite is true. I am not a good person, and restraint of me is a good thing. Because if I do whatever I want to do, somebody else is going to suffer for it, and I chiefly, because I will harm my own soul. But then I will harm other people. So that's the first lie. Sexual indulgence is natural and healthy for you. No, it's not. Secondly, chastity is impossible. So don't even bother trying. Lewis makes one comment here. I could spend a great deal of time on this, but he says, very often what God first helps us towards is not the virtue itself, but the power of always trying again. So it's not the virtue of chastity, but the reward of always aspiring to it, because you recognize there's a good in it. And so you, as Augustine says, who was promiscuous before he became a bishop and devoted himself to the faith and so forth, Lord, I want to love you, and I don't love you. No, it's not Augustine. It's the Nun's Priest Tale by Chaucer. Lord, I don't love you, and I don't want to love you, but I want to love you. I don't love you, I don't want to love you, but I want to love you. That comes from God. The desire to please, even though you, in a sense, don't want the consequence of it because it's so hard, it's so contrary to your desires. So he says, very often God first helps us towards not the virtue itself, but the power of wanting and trying again. And however important chastity, and then he goes on to say, or courage or truthfulness or any other virtue may be, this process trains us in the habits of the soul, which are more important. And he reiterates this, and I think this is the strength of his position in book 3, is he argues that morality is there to set our soul right. He's consistent in coming back to this point. It's not for other people, although other people will benefit from it. It's for ourselves that we're called to be law obedient to a law. It teaches us to depend on God. When we fail, which we always do, it teaches us that we need God. And there's good in that because we will be with God. We're already with God and we will always be with God. So it also, when we fail, teaches us that we can't trust ourselves, even in our best moments. And as a result, also that we don't need to despair in our worst because our failures are actually forgiven. So if we know the grace of God and the love of God, it teaches us something about our lack of ability to obey the law, but also the infinite mercy of God. Third lie, by the way, repressed sex is dangerous. It's the opposite. Non-repressed sex is dangerous. We used to have a law in this country against rape and sodomy. Used to be throughout the Western world. The law against both. Do you know what the punishment for rape is in Scripture? It's death penalty. Yep. We don't even use the word rape now. And the punishment for it is very slight, which suggests that the consequence of rape is not very grievous. So the punishment is in accordance with the belief in the iniquity of the crime committed. Rape is not that serious, and that's why we're not giving you a serious consequence for it. But in Scripture, it is seen that way. And so note how rape has dropped out of parlance, and yet the practice proliferates. Because I think it does now. It did in the 80s when I went to university. They had a rape truck that we used to go through the campus. Women who were afraid and so forth, they could call it up. There were little phones all around. We didn't have cell phones. You'd pick it up and call, and the truck would come pick you up, because that was in the 80s. They don't even have them anymore. So repressed sex is dangerous? No, it is not. It's the opposite. Sex without restraint is extraordinarily dangerous, and particular for those who are vulnerable. And that means women and children, most particularly children. So, does that mean that sexual immorality is the most, or is the supreme vice? He says, absolutely not. That's what's interesting. Having pushed so strongly against the cultural norm and says that this is the one we dislike the most, I am going to go on to say that the sins of the flesh are bad, but they're the least bad of all the sins. The worst pleasures are purely spiritual. Putting other people in the wrong, bossing and patronizing, and being a spoil sport. He says what he calls backbiting, the pleasure of power, of hatred. These are spiritual and sins, and they're far worse. Now, he follows Dante in this, by the way. And I think he's actually correct. I said that Dante is, in some sense, theologically, his portrait of hell is not as scriptural. It isn't with respect to good and evil, but with respect to the moral nature of mankind. Dante's is more accurate, I think. Because Jesus says, fear not those who will kill the body, but rather them who will destroy your soul. It suggests a gradation, a hierarchy. I've run out of time here pretty much. Do you have any questions? I didn't get on to anything that I wanted to, Christian marriage and headship and all that sort of stuff, which would have been fun to get into and created all sorts of controversy and so forth. And I didn't get onto the 3 theological virtues and so forth at the end. But comments or questions? If not, I will be finished for today. I'm done for today then. Okay. That's enough.